What's up guys, and welcome to a different video. I am dubbing this video Pokémon Logic. It might be a one-off video or it might be a little series I do. It depends how many ideas I get. If you guys have any ideas once you see what the sort of video is about. But basically, this isn't going to be looking at, oh look at this stupid Pokémon Logic. This is the opposite of that. It's going to be saying, okay, so this is how it is in the Pokémon world. Is there actually some sort of logic to that? Does that actually make sense if we apply our world to it, basically? And as you can tell by today's video, or this video, we're looking at why are some Pokemon rarer than others? Why are, for example, the starters hardly ever available in the wild? Obviously there are sometimes, for example, the Friend Safari, but why are they hardly ever available in the wild? Why do we only get them as, starter Pokemon? Stuff like that. So that's what we're going to be going through today. We're going to be looking at, basically, I've got on a list of Pokemon I would identify as rare. Obviously it's not all of them, because I've just gone through the list of all Pokemon and thought, yeah, that's pretty rare, but it's a good sort of sample size at least. It's a decent amount. We've got 169 rare Pokemon, so it would definitely be a good sort of stuff to go over here. So as we're applying our world to the Pokemon world, we need to look at why some animals in this world are rare or endangered. Why are they, why are some, I can't remember off the top of my head, but why is, for some tigers, for example, not very rare, not very common rather, whereas, you get your classic birds that fly around everywhere, then, you can get them anywhere basically, you get the idea there. Well, there are two main reasons why an animal may become rare or threatened or endangered or maybe even extinct. One of those is loss of habitat, the other one is loss of genetic variation. If we look at the habitat first, basically it can be natural or it can be human-caused, a man-made sort of occurrence that it actually then leads to. For example, one natural example of endangerment and extinction is the Dinosaur Extinction, however long that was ago. A meteor hit the Earth, put loads of dust and such into the atmosphere, covered the sun, so the Earth got very cold, hence the dinosaurs started to die out, they became endangered, and eventually they became extinct. That's an example of a natural way of it happening. For example, if a tsunami wiped out a whole island, then obviously any animals living there are then going to be killed, and obviously if the species only lived on that island, it will become extinct, for example. Human activity can be a range of things. It can be deforestation, as we know, rainforests, that's what people, that's a big issue with deforestation. You wipe out a load of trees, the animals living in those trees are going to have nowhere to live anymore except other trees, but there are still some animals there, which means that they're going to have to fight it out. Eventually the population size decreases, and you end up with less animals than before, and if it carries on, you're going to end up with no animals basically. So deforestation is one example. Development in area is another one. It doesn't necessarily have to be destroying the habitat, it just has to be shrinking the habitat. So if you come in, if you've got a load of fields and you put houses in them, any animals, even if they're just mice or little bugs, any animals living there can they can't really live there anymore, so their habitat has shrunk. If that happens again and again and again, obviously eventually they are going to become endangered or rarer and less easy to find. So that's the loss of habitat basically. If you remove the habitat, the animal has nowhere to live, because if the animal can only live in a very cold place and force them to go to a hot place, they're not going to be able to live there and eventually they will die out. That's loss of habitat. The other one is loss of genetic variation, which is a bit more intricate. So if you have a very large population of animals, you have a lot of genetic variation. There's going to be a lot of crossbreeding between different groups of animals, sharing genetic code, genetic information. Whereas if you have a very small population, say only 10 animals, as the generations go on, there's going to be a lot more inbreeding. As we know, inbreeding, or as I'm assuming most people know, inbreeding is not a great thing, as I mentioned, because there's not as much genetic information being shared. This means you have the same genetic information passing down through the generations over and over, nothing new being introduced, and that makes you very susceptible to getting more likely to catch diseases and to die from those diseases, because you can't protect yourself against them. Whereas if you share genetic information all over, obviously you don't, you get a lot of extra sort of resistances built up rather than having to deal with the same code all the way down generation after generation. Hence, more diseases, more problems like that. These groups are less likely to survive and eventually they will die out. So inbreeding, basically, not a good thing. So once you already get a small population, it then just goes downhill from there. So it's not very good to start off with. How can you get a small population? Well, obviously overhunting or overfishing particularly is a big thing. Actually, again, reduces the population size, or even just killing the animals in general. You're going to get less animals, more inbreeding, and that's just going to speed up the process of the population running out basically. Because if you have less breeding pairs, you have less variation, and then you just end up with just less animals in general. So generally, loss of habitat or loss of genetic variation, humans can be evolved in both of them, or it can just happen naturally over time. But these are the factors that lead to animals becoming endangered or extinct in our world. So how can we apply this to the Pokemon world? Well, as I said, I identified 167 rare Pokemon, and I'm going to go through all of them, and we're going to say, okay, so these are rare because that makes sense, sort of thing. Starting off, we're going to get rid of the two big groups to start off with. The rare Pokemon I've identified, all of the starters are in them, all 6 starter, families, so 6 times 3 times 3, there's 3 starters per generation, 6 generations, 3 Pokemon per, I'm classing 167 rare Pokemon as the whole family, I guess. Starter Pokemon as well as fossil Pokemon, because again, we know why they're rare, sort of thing. But first, before we actually go on further, we have to talk about breeding in the Pokemon games, have a little breeding lesson here. So if you have a male Bulbasaur and a female Bulbasaur, if you put them in the daycare, you get an egg and it's going to hatch into another Bulbasaur. That's a lot of sense, that makes easy sense there. If you then get rid of the male Bulbasaur and bring in another Pokemon that's in the same egg group, so for example a male Oddish, have a male Oddish and a female Bulbasaur, they'll give you an egg and it will be a Bulbasaur again, so that's good. However, if you instead took the female Bulbasaur away, so you have a male Bulbasaur and a female Oddish, you're going to get an Oddish egg. Basically in Pokemon, if it's 2 different species, the female will always give you, the female will give you the egg basically. However, of course, this is the only exceptions when you have a Ditto, so you have a male Bulbasaur and a Ditto, you get another Bulbasaur. So the only way for a male Pokemon to carry on its generation, if it was the last Pokemon in existence, the only way for the male Pokemon to carry on its line, its lineage, would be to breed with a Ditto. So bear that in mind for the moment. So basically, females, lots of females are good. Obviously, you don't want too many females. Having too many females is never a bad thing. However, if you have a very small male population, that's not good either. But if you have, a good spread of male to females, that's perfect. So, what do starter Pokemon, fossil Pokemon, and some other Pokemon have in common as well? Well, their gender ratios. Their gender ratios are all 87.5% male and 12.5% female. So basically, only an eighth of the population, if we apply that gender ratio to the whole population, out of the whole population, only an eighth of them are females. So if you assume, maybe obviously it's a bit iffy in the games because eggs don't take that long to produce, but if you assume Pokemon breed once a year, just as a generic rule, we're assuming here, but it's a generic rule, let's say, they breed once a year, so say let all those females get bred, okay? So that's an eighth of the population. Say the population is 80 in size, so 10 females breed with 10 males. The other 60 males don't do anything. So you just get 10 males and 10 females. The population size is going to increase by 10. So maybe it's an eighth again, so maybe you get 1 or 2 more females in that size. So it's increased slightly. However, if you apply this over a large time, we don't exactly know how long Pokemon lifespans are. We can assume they're fairly long, but they're not infinite. So maybe over time, this population size is going to decrease. Because the second year you've only got 12 females, so you get 12 more, so it's gone up again, maybe, but then eventually you're going to have all these males that are going to get older and they're going to die out, and that's going to be it. So basically, 87.5% male, 12.5% female is a very bad gender ratio because you have a lot of males, hardly any females, so you're not going to get a great return. Whereas 50% male, 50% female, on the same population size, you're going to get a lot more eggs and babies basically created that way. There are 26 other Pokemon, as I mentioned, that also have this gender ratio alongside the starter Pokemon and the fossil Pokemon. So that's why the starters are rare basically. Fossil Pokemon also have this gender ratio, but obviously it's not necessarily the case why they're rare, it's more the case why, we know they were most likely wiped out in a similar sort of thing to how the dinosaurs were wiped out on our Earth, but of the ones that survived, obviously if we assume, okay, only an eighth of them are males, even if 800 of them survived, over time that population size is going to decrease, and it would have just sped up the extinction period, extinction rate of the prehistoric Pokemon. One Pokemon to point out from the other set though is Relicanth. Relicanth is mentioned in its Pokédex entries to have lived for over 100 million years, or hasn't changed much in 100 million years, so we can assume it was alive at the same time as sort of the prehistoric Pokemon, the fossil Pokemon we've got, except of course it was in the sea, so there wasn't as much change to its environment when they became extinct, so it survived on, but obviously it's still fairly rare because of the fact it has a very high amount of male percentage, yes. The 26 other Pokemon that have the gender ratio, as well as all these starter Pokemon, are the Eevee line, hence why Eevee is fairly rare, as well as the Togepi line, again Togepi is fairly rare. Then also we have Relicanth, as I've mentioned. Then after that we have Riolu and Lucario, fairly rare again. Then Pansage, Pansear and Panpour, not as rare as the others, but they still have this gender ratio, which is why they're not openly common. You can't find them in most places in Unova. They're only on a few routes, and they're not very common. They're fairly uncommon or rare. So and then obviously the gender ratio is why that's the case. Then we have Zorua. Again, Zoroark you can't catch in the wild as far as I remember. So that's why they're rare there. Oh, and the last two Pokemon are Munchlax and Snorlax. Again, I mean, another thing for Snorlax is the fact that it sleeps most of the time, so it's not going to have too much breeding. So that's the case, it's probably rare. But those are the 26 other Pokemon there, and that's a total of 101 Pokemon with that sort of gender ratio. All the starters, the fossil Pokemon, as well as Aerodactyl, all the fossil Pokemon, you get what I mean. As well as these 26 other Pokemon, but there are still 68 left, so why are these other 68 rare if they have sort of 50-50 gender ratios? Well, some of them don't necessarily have 50-50 gender ratios, but they have single ratios, so they're single gender. For example, we have the Tyrogue line, Tyrogue, Hitmonchan, Hitmonlee and Hitmontop, all males. Chansey line is all females, Tauros all males, Miltank all females, and then Kangaskhan all females again, which is a bit tricky. For males, again, then there's no females of their lineage to breed with, so they can't, they got to breed with a Ditto basically. It's a bit tricky though, in case, because also we know Dittos aren't amazingly rare, so we don't know quite how they breed in the wild. It is possible, maybe, it's just a simple rule for the Pokemon series that a female always, gives the egg. However, it's possible in the wild in Pokemon sometimes that maybe the male is the one that hatches from the egg, the male Pokemon hatches from the egg instead of the female. We don't quite know. It might be slightly different in the wild, we don't know again. So, but basically that's why they have a low population, because they don't have any females to breed with, so they have to find either Dittos, or there's a very low chance that the male side can actually, carry on the lineage with the egg there. Of course, females, they don't have any male members of their own species to breed with, so they either have to find Dittos, or males of other species to breed with. Of course, this isn't too bad for some of them. For example, we have some full female Pokemon like Petilil, Flabebe. They're fairly common, so this might not be too hard for those. But for these ones, Chansey, Miltank, and Kangaskhan, they might have been rare in the first place already. And of course, say only 50% of this population actually finds a male of another species to be able to breed with, to carry on the egg. That's eventually not going to add up to a full amount, basically. So that might be why these particular Pokemon have a bit of trouble reproducing. There are other full males as well, for example Nidoran male's line, but of course I'm assuming in this point that Nidoran male and Nidoran female are actually the same species almost, but they can still breed across and it will work out similar to that. Sork and Throw are also there as full males, however they're not as rare as others, so it's not as much of a problem. So we can assume again with Tyrogue line and Taurus's line that there was a fairly low population to begin with. It's lowered over time. It's further ahead. It started beforehand, and it might end up being that Throw and Sork in the future, a couple hundred years down the line, might actually be just as rare basically. So that's why there are some more Pokemon there. Then we have one genderless Pokemon I'm going to look at here, which is Beldum. Beldum are most likely very rare to begin with. Pokédex entries talk about them having magnetism in their blood, basically. So they're evidently a very rare Pokemon. They're most likely created with some sort of mutation from magnets in the Earth's crust, basically. So they might have been a single sort of creational moment in the Pokemon history, and they've just come out from there, which means the population was very low to begin with. And obviously, genderless Pokemon can only be bred using a Ditto. So again, breeding isn't great for them. However, Beldum most likely have a longer lifespan than other Pokemon, I would assume, at least because they are metal basically, so that's most likely the reason there. There are other genderless Pokemon I'm going to look at in a minute, but there are other reasons why they are rare, more clear reasons basically. So now we're down to 57 Pokemon remaining. Then 2 more lines to look at we have here are man-made Pokemon, and this is the Porygon line and the cast form line. Porygon, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z are basically made of code. They're created by humans, and obviously the evolutions occur via sort of basically like just discs and CDs. So that's exactly, obviously they're not going to chug out Porygons over and over and over and make them overpopulate, so they've only made a few, is the reason why. Then cast form was obviously made by the Weather Institute, similar sort of thing there. They're not going to chug out Pokemon after Pokemon. There are obviously ethics concerned with this creation of life almost. So it's very unlikely that they would make a load of them. So that's why cast form cannot be found in the wild. So we're down to 53 more now. So we have to look at Pokedex entries to find out basically about habitats for these other Pokemon. First up we have Clefairy, Cleffa, Clefairy and Clefable. We learned that Clefairy actually came from the moon, or it's theorised that Clefairy came from the moon. If that's the case, it's very likely that again only a small population came from the moon, and if they arrived on meteorites, these meteorites were very localised around the planet. So they can't, it's not like they've spread out over time. They've stayed near the meteorite, near the crash landing site basically, and that's why they're not amazingly rare, because they haven't actually integrated fully into the Pokemon world's environment. They've stayed near where they landed. Lapras. In Lapras Pokédex entries, it's actually mentioned that Lapras were hunted almost to extinction, so that's why they're very rare there. Nothing more really needs to be said. It's explicitly mentioned they were hunted almost to extinction, so that's why Lapras are pretty darn rare. Dratini's Pokédex entries mentioned that it was thought to be just a mythical Pokemon, but was actually only recently found in an underground pool. So we can assume the habitat for Dratini to live in is a very specific habitat underground in some sort of lake or pool. And obviously they've only just recently discovered that they're actually real. So these are obviously very deep and hidden away places. So that's why Dratini are rare, because they have a very specified habitat. Or of course we might not just have found the proper area where they live yet. Wobbuffet and Wynaut are 2 more I'm looking at here for the Dex entries. It's actually mentioned in Wobbuffet's Dex entries that it's never the one to attack first and always hides in the darkness. So possibly the reason why Wobbuffet seems so rare is because it just hides away and shuns away from interacting with other people, which is a very very clear and likely theory. So it's either just shuns away and hides away itself, which means the population hasn't spread out too much. It's a very small population size, and of course it's not seen by humans that often. Then we have the Larvitar line. The reason I've picked this, obviously Larvitar are fairly rare, and in Larvitar's Pokédex entry, it's mentioned that Larvitar do not fully mature until they eat an entire mountain. Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but of course, what happens if a Larvitar doesn't eat an entire mountain? Does it, die before it matures? That would seem a likely option. So maybe the reason why the Larvitar line are pretty rare is because obviously there's not enough mountains, or there's not enough food, I will put in quotation marks, not enough food for each Larvitar to mature. So a lot of Larvitar die in their youth basically, because they can't get enough nutrition from the rocks, if that makes any sense. Then we have the Ralts line. Ralts' Pokédex entries say that obviously the horn on its head can actually detect people's emotions, and it's hardly ever seen by people, and the reason for this most likely is it is just walking around, and if it sees an angry person, it can detect the person is angry, and knowing Ralts is a very timid Pokemon, it most likely runs away. So Ralts, they may not be specifically rare, but we don't see them too often, so again they're shunning away from people. They might assuming they can sense Pokemon's emotions too, they may well shun away from Pokemon as well and keep themselves to themselves. Then we have Phoebus and Milotic. This is a bit of a weird one. Phoebus' Pokédex entries specifically say that it can live in almost any habitat. However, it's not that common. It says that they can live in seas or rivers, however they prefer rivers. So it's most likely that, we know in some games Phoebus is only available in a specific spot on a certain route, which is most likely the case for most areas. Phoebus is a very localized Pokemon. Yes, okay, it might be able to live anywhere, but there's one fish in an ocean of other Pokemon, so it's unlikely to find it in those areas. Whereas even if in the ponds and rivers where it usually lives, apparently they're with thick weed, which again Phoebus can use to hide in, and just generally avoids people and maybe other Pokemon too. Then we have the Bagon line. They are dragons to the start, so they may well have been hunted in the past to reduce their population, or at least used for Battling, that's another reason. Overhunting, but in the Pokemon world we could also have overcatching, I guess, that you could refer to it as. But in the Pokédex entries of Bagon as well, they mention that it jumps off of cliffs to toughen its head up. We can assume a lot of Bagon also die during this process as well. If they're not tough enough, they're just going to get their head smashed in. So that may well be why Bagon's population is fairly low and why it's quite rare. Then we have Spiritomb. Spiritomb is a bit weird. It's not quite legendary, but it is special, and this is because it's related to the odd keystone. It's mentioned in the Pokédex entries that it's, binded to a keystone, and that's obviously the reason why it's quite rare, because it's made of 108 spirits, and it has to have an odd keystone used in its creation almost. So that's the reason why it's not very common. Then we have Gibble, Gibite, and Garchomp. Pokédex entries of Gibble mention that it lives specifically in sort of like notches in cave walls in the dark. So again, that's it's got a very specialized habitat. It's most likely not it's not every cave. I think it's also mentioned it has to be a geothermal area. So again, that's a very, very specialized location. It's not like, oh yeah, it's found in caves like Geodude, for example. No, it needs to be a geothermal area. It needs to be specialized. So that's why Gibble is fairly rare there. Then we have Mamoswine. Notice this is not the full line of Swinub, Piloswine, Mamoswine. It's simply just Mamoswine, because Mamoswine did exist in the past, in the prehistoric era, and it's mentioned in Pokédex entries that it was believed to have been wiped out, or was almost wiped out to extinction a long time ago. Why is it not very rare now? Well, obviously to evolve Piloswine to Mamoswine, you need to learn Ancient Power, which isn't a very common move almost. So in the wild, it's very unlikely for a Piloswine to be able to learn Ancient Power, since we can assume in the past maybe big Mamoswines would have taught their children Piloswines that actually to evolve and grow up larger, they need to be able to learn this specific move. Of course, if they can't evolve. So that's maybe why it doesn't happen too much in the wild. Then we have Munna and Mashana. Why are these rare? Well, Mashana, as you can see, spends a lot of his time asleep, devouring dreams, so maybe just doesn't spend a lot of time breeding. That's possibly why the reason why Mashana is rare. Just doesn't have much time for breeding on its hands. Then we have Axew and Dano and their respective lines. I'm doing these together because both their Pokédex entries specifically mention that encounters between either two members of the Fraxure family or a Dano or a Zuelis with any member of any Pokemon are very violent encounters. So we can assume a lot of Fraxure and Axew actually die at a young age when fighting others, just to sort of gain leadership almost. And if they lose, that's it. They don't get to breed on. So that's possibly why they're quite rare there. And the same sort of goes with Dano and Zuelis. If they're very violent, a lot of them are going to die at a young age, and they're not going to get through to adulthood, basically. Then we have Larvesta and Volcarona. Their Pokédex entries mention that they must live at the base of a volcano. How common are volcanoes in both this world and the Pokemon world? Not too common. Yes, we have Cinnabar Island Volcano. The volcano Heatran lives in Sinnoh, but I can't think of any more past that. So, it's not it's a very specialised habitat for them to live in, so you're not going to find them anywhere else. Then we have Goomy from Generation 6. Goomy mentions that it must live in damp and dark places, or otherwise it will dry out. So either one, it lives in other places and doesn't make it to adulthood because it's not damp and dry enough, or two, it's a specialised habitat, so it hides away in these damp and dark places and doesn't get seen too much. Then finally, the last dex entry we're looking at is Noibat. Noibat and Noivern. It mentions that Noibat has to live in very dark caves, so yet again, it's deep in caves, not somewhere where people obviously go to very much, and again it's specialised habitat, so it's not going to have a huge population size just because of that. So there are a few more to look at that aren't necessarily mentioned specifically from Dex entries, but we can infer from other information we have. The first of these is the Pikachu line. Why is Pikachu? Pikachu is fairly rare in most games. It can only be found on one or two routes, if that. So why is it rare? Well, Pikachu is the front point of Pokemon in general. It's the most well-known Pokemon, everything like that, and we can assume in the Pokemon world it's very similar. It's even mentioned a few times in the Pokemon world. People are like, oh yeah, I love Pikachu. So it's very likely in the past people liked Pikachu so much that they overcaught it, took them out of the habitat and lowered the population of Pikachus, basically. That's how that happened. That's why you have less Pikachus now, because people took Pikachus away in the past, overcaught it, overfarmed it, hunted it, whatever you want to call it. there are less Pikachus now than there were before. Then we have Ditto. Ditto is a common fan theory, is a failed Mew clone, so again that's possibly why it's quite rare. But Ditto is possibly reproducing itself via mitosis, just splitting itself into 2 more Dittos. That's a possibility for it to happen, and that would explain why it's quite rare, because mitosis on a full Pokemon isn't exactly something you'd want to do every day. So mitosis is definitely an option for Ditto, and obviously the fact that it's a failed Mew clone, as we like to believe, would explain exactly why it's quite rare. Then we have Unknown. Unknown is not a legendary, although some films would like it to be so, but it's only found in certain locations, of course, like the ruins of Alph, etc. And they also live properly in their own dimension, so we can assume in their own dimension Unknown are numerous. There's possibly hundreds and thousands of Unknown in their own dimension, and they leak through into these certain locations, but of course they're not especially common in our world. So that's, if we manage to go to their dimension, yeah, I'm sure you could catch an Unknown for days, but in our dimension, not really. Then I've picked out here the Slackoff line. Slackoff are fairly rare. I believe in Hone they're only found in Restburg Forest, something along those lines. Peterburg Forest, that's the one. But they're only found there, and possibly the reason for this is that Slackoff are just lazy. They don't have time for reproduction. Anybody got time for that? Then we have Combee. Combee's a bit of a particular one. Of course, in the games, 2 Combees can breed together just fine. However, it's possible that in reality, only Vespiquen can actually produce offspring. Vespiquen are only available if they're female Combee to evolve into, so it's very likely that, obviously in the Pokemon world, Combee can only be created or reproduce with a queen, a Vespiquen, very much like bees and wasps in our own world. So it's very likely that's the reason why they're quite rare, because of course there aren't that many male Combees or female Combees to begin with, because of course of the gender ratio. So that's the reason there. Then we have finally Rotoma. Rotoma is apparently some form of plasma, so it was possibly created in some sort of mutational event, which explains why it's fairly rare. There are several Rotoma around, and they were possibly created at the same time or in localized areas around the world, but they're not a naturally occurring Pokemon, I would assume. Possibly only popping up now because of the increase in technology in the Pokemon world. So that's a possibility why they are so rare, because they're not commonly around like Rattata or Oddish or anything along those lines. And that brings us to 0 Pokemon, guys. Of the 169 rare Pokemon that I identified, I've, in my opinion of course, briefly explained why they are rarer than other Pokemon. Of course this video is just for fun, I'm not being serious and trying to put logic onto every single aspect of the Pokemon world, but if you would like to see some more Pokemon Logic, feel free to let me know. I'm sorry this video has gone on for so long, I didn't intend it to be this long, but hopefully you enjoyed it either way. If you have any more ideas for stuff I could cover with Pokemon Logic, maybe you have something in the Pokemon world that you could say, oh, maybe that's explained in the real, by physics or whatever in the real world. Can you make sense of it, basically? Let me know any ideas you have below in the comment section. I'm happy for this to be a one-off video though. If you guys enjoyed it, that's always good. But this is going to be it for me for today. If you did enjoy it, hit the like button and drop a comment. But for now, I'll be seeing you next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, my friends.